So we're continuing our series today on trauma surrounding pregnancy and childbirth. And it's lovely to have you with us here today, Grace. Do you just want to introduce yourself briefly?
Yeah, so I'm Grace. I'm married to Roger and we've got 3 children, Leah, Johnny and Josie. I'm a doctor. I used to be an obstetrician and worked in hospital medicine for quite some time. And now I work as a GP.
So we're going to be thinking about postnatal anxiety today, aren't we? So do you just want to tell us a little bit about the difference between, is there a difference between postnatal anxiety and postnatal depression?
Yeah, so I think it'll probably come out a little bit as we talk about me, but I think postnatal anxiety is part of postnatal depression, and actually it's just a manifestation of it in a different way. But I think what you'll probably find with most people if they're really, really anxious is that they won't think of themselves as being depressed, because they're not depressed, and I definitely wasn't depressed, but I was extremely anxious.
Okay.
But it's definitely very similar because it comes in the postnatal period. And it's often treated with sort of the same medication or the same help and support as somebody with postnatal depression would be treated.
So do you want to just tell us about your first pregnancy and what happened during that and after?
I was working as an obstetric doctor, as a registrar, and it took us a couple of years to get pregnant with my eldest. I had very irregular periods. It was just difficult. So when I got pregnant, I only found out when I was about 9 or 10 weeks. I think I just compartmentalised the pregnancy, put it to one side, got on with my job, and I was working full-time up until about 39 weeks. I tried not to think too much about it, and I think one of the thoughts that came to me when I was reflecting on this was that I was actually just didn't really try and think about the pregnancy at all. So I didn't buy any clothing for the baby. I didn't buy any equipment. I didn't want to think about actually the baby being healthy. In fact, I thought the baby would be poorly in some way. I kind of expected a problem. I remember I bought the first onesie for my baby when I was 36 weeks pregnant, and I burst into tears in mother care because I just thought, actually, if it's born now, the baby might be okay. So when I gave birth, it was absolutely fine. I was busy working at my computer, doing a presentation for work, and then my waters broke, and we went into hospital. I had her on her due date. So she was fine, and we were discharged home a couple of days later. And then I started to really, really struggle. So I got very, very anxious about everything, about her sleeping, about her feeding, about whether she was sleeping on somebody, whether she should be sleeping in her cot. She should never go to sleep on somebody. She should always be in her cot. She should feed at the times that I determined. She had to feed every 3 hours. If it was just before, like a minute before 10 o'clock, and she was due to feed at 10 and she was crying, I wouldn't feed her. I would bounce her around and try and help her in any other way. I wouldn't let somebody else feed her. I didn't like her going to other people because they might rock her off to sleep and she wasn't meant to be asleep. I wouldn't get her out of the cot if she was crying, if she was meant to be asleep. I would rock the cot and try and get her off to sleep. And everything was revolved around this time and this schedule. And I think just as time went on, I got worse and worse and worse. I couldn't sleep at night. If she was sleeping, I would just watch her. And I couldn't get off to sleep myself. I couldn't sleep if somebody else held her. I would just be watching them and checking that they were doing the right things with her. I couldn't go out and leave her. I couldn't go out with somebody else because I had to just watch her. I think what I kind of always describe it as is the feelings of bonding between me and her were so overwhelming, so massive, and everyone has those feelings of bonding. They're normal, they're what you're meant to have, aren't they, to allow you to look after and love and care for your child. But that was so overwhelming. I couldn't eat, I felt physically sick all of the time, and I just could not stop this constant merry-go-round in my head.
So at what point did you actually realise that you weren't well, that you needed help?
I think it was about 4 weeks after she was born, and I think I just hadn't really slept, and I still couldn't. And people were coming round. I know my mum was around a lot, my husband was at home. I might have started to go back to work then, I'm not sure. And people were coming round and I couldn't hold conversations with them. I couldn't think about anything that wasn't focused on the clock or on my daughter doing what I needed her to do. I think I began to realise that I was constantly in tears and so overwhelmed. And I can't remember now, I can't remember if it was that somebody, like my mum or my husband said, look, go to the GP, or whether a little bit in me that kind of, almost from my past life at that point, knew that I wasn't well. And I popped to see the GP at she was about 4 weeks old, because it was definitely before the 6-week check. And it's quite amazing. I popped to see the GP that I probably would never normally have gone to see for this sort of situation, except he was amazing, because I think I just burst into tears on him. And I think he probably was a little bit like, what do I do with this woman? But I think because I just was not my normal self, and I think he met me before and knew I wasn't my normal self. And he very quickly just referred me on to the perinatal and postnatal mental health team. And they saw me a couple of weeks later. So now, as a doctor, reflecting back, I actually got help quite quickly.
Yes.
So either he was a lot more concerned about me than I really picked up at the time, or perhaps just the process was easier then, I don't know. It is 14 years ago.
So what did that help look like in practice?
So I went to see the perinatal mental health team, and where we were living at the time, they have a whole department and hospital geared to perinatal and postnatal support, an inpatient unit and an outpatient unit. So they had me in the outpatient unit, for some time, just going backwards and forwards to clinic appointments. They also had a mental health worker who used to come and visit me at home, and she did some CBT with me, which was really, really helpful, because she did that with, I suppose, she wasn't telling me what to do, she was exploring my thoughts and my concerns, and it was very much led by me and what I needed, because I know people have all sorts of different views about CBT, but I found it really, really helpful. And they also had groups which I used to go to regularly at the hospital, where they would bring a lot of women together who had similar but different experiences, and that was again also really helpful. I began to realise that I was not mad, I was ill. And
Had that actually been a concern of yours, that you were?
I thought I was losing it. I thought that, that my brain had just completely fried, that I was completely losing it, and that it was my fault.
Right.
It was my thing to sort out. I needed to rectify my brain, because my brain was wrong. And it was, in one sense, it was me that was struggling. But the first appointment I went to at the hospital with the psychiatrist, after speaking to me and taking all the history, she said to me, "You've got postnatal depression." And that's what she called it. But she said, "You're anxious." And I said, "I don't have postnatal depression. I'm not depressed." And she said, "No, you've got anxiety, and it's a form of postnatal depression. You've got postnatal anxiety and you're unwell." And it was such a relief. It literally was that kind of burden taken away.
And almost to realise that it wasn't your fault.
It wasn't my fault. It wasn't something that I could have prevented either. It kind of was, it almost, in one sense, almost viewing it as external to me. It came at me. I couldn't have prevented it. I think it probably started in pregnancy, actually.
Right.
But I couldn't have solved this problem. And that was a real relief. And also, it was fixable. It was likely that I would get better.
So how long did it take till you felt back to your normal self, I suppose?
I think about 6 to 8 months. So I went back to work at 9 months, and I went back to work full time. I do remember, even at the sort of 6 to 7 months and 8 month period, I went through this whole process of getting Leah to take a bottle. Looking back, I was very regimented about how I did that, very controlled. And that was one of my biggest issues, was how controlling I was over everything in her life. And so I don't think I was quite right. But I think by the time she went back to nursery and I went back to work, I think there was about a month or so where I felt more, what I would say, my normal self.
Right.
It meant that I haven't mentioned this, but it meant that I kept on forgetting to take my medication,
Right.
which in actual fact was a good thing,
Yeah.
because I was beginning to feel a lot better.
So just on that note of medication, were you put on
Yeah.
medication, and what impact did that have, do you think?
So I was put on sertraline,
Right.
and I was put that on, so that's an antidepressant. I was put on that as soon as I saw the psychiatrist. We had a chat about it, and at that point I was at such rock bottom. I wanted anything to make me feel better. Interestingly, and again this is something that people have different experiences of, but they did at that point question me about whether I wanted to continue breastfeeding, not because of the sertraline, but actually because a lot of my problems were around this bonding and almost being over bonded, the emotions of looking after and caring for my daughter were so strong, and actually trying to reduce that down a little bit may well have been helpful. But for me, I felt that was the only thing at that point. I felt that was the only thing I was doing competently.
Right.
And I wanted to continue. So I continued breastfeeding. I took the sertraline and was very, very happy with that, really. I suppose one of the things I would mention is that there is some very good resources out there, and one of the ones that's really, really helpful for medication in pregnancy and in the breastfeeding and postnatal period is something called BUMPS,
Okay.
which we recommend at work. So I've no problem recommending that
Right.
as a website, which is really, really useful.
So you went on to have 2 subsequent children. Did the same issue come back?
It did. So I very much thought I'd be fine. So after I'd had Leah and after I'd kind of gone through the process and was feeling better, when they discharged me, they said, "You've got a 50% chance of this coming back."
Right.
I thought, that's great. 50% chance of it coming back means 50% chance it won't come back. And I'll be that person because I've got loads of insight. I'm a doctor. I know what I'm dealing with. You know, I don't think I was cocky, but I think I just thought I can make this work. It's probably the same problem. You know, I can solve this. I can prevent this from happening to me again. I went on to have my son. He was a dream baby. But he came, I think I probably finished work probably a few days before he came. He came very quickly, very quick delivery. And then he ended up on the neonatal unit for a few days. Because he just didn't breathe properly, which is fine. And then we went together to a transitional care unit, which is a fabulous unit actually, where you stay with your baby when they need a little bit of extra support, but you're in as well. Which was probably really, really good because I started to deteriorate on that ward and I knew it. I was getting incredibly anxious. He wouldn't sleep on his back. He wanted to sleep on his side. I was petrified that would mean that something really bad would happen to him. We had a family history of cot death in my family, so you know, anything about their sleep, I wanted them to do exactly as they should in my mind. I just completely nosedived. And on the ward, we actually they brought the consultant to see me, and they wanted to admit me to the inpatient unit at the mental health hospital, but we refused. I just kind of said, I think you just need to give me the medication, to be honest. I know I'm awful, and I know I look awful at the moment, but I think if I start taking the meds and you let me go home, I think I'll be okay. Right. And they were great. They let me do that. And so in one sense, I got better a little bit faster with him because I got on the medication a little bit earlier. All my children have always gone by the book when it comes to, you know, people talk about good babies. It's rubbish in that sense. There's neither good nor bad babies. They're just who they are. But I think this was always about me. My children were never ones to be up at night screaming. I didn't have colicky babies. I didn't have babies who were, you know, other people would go, yeah, there is a difficulty here. You've got a baby that's really struggling. I didn't have that. And so in fact, I sometimes felt really guilty because I was the mum with you know,
Yes.
other people's impression when my babies were perfect in so many ways in the way that they did life. And yet I was a wreck. So I felt really guilty about being that person. But yeah, so, and then with my youngest, I made what I think is a very sensible choice then. I expected it to come on again. So at 36 weeks, I started taking sertraline before she was born.
Right.
There are risks and benefits, you have to play them with pregnancy, but we decided that the benefits of having a mum, especially with two under threes at that point, the benefits of having a mum who was able to function and be healthy was really, really important. And that was so much better. I actually enjoyed the postnatal period in a way that I didn't know you could.
Okay.
And so it still distresses me now that I didn't have that with the first two, but at least I did get that with the third. And it's not an issue of bonding, it's simply an issue of my enjoyment of that time.
Yeah. You mentioned your husband a few minutes ago. Unfortunately, he's not able to join us today, but I know you have spoken to him. So how was all this time of your illness for him? How did he cope with it? How did he manage you, being a new dad as well?
So I think his words when I asked him that question was, it was confusing. He found the whole time period really, really confusing. So he didn't really know what to do with me. He didn't know what to expect because he was a new dad. And, you know, in that sense, neither of us knew what to expect. I think he found me really confusing. And so initially wanted to kind of rationally talk to me about it, to kind of say it doesn't matter. You know, if you feed her at 9:45 rather than 10 o'clock, that obviously doesn't matter, because to him, rationally, it didn't matter. And then he was just coming up against almost a brick wall of my anxiety, and realising that he couldn't change how I was.
Right.
And I think that was one of the biggest things for him, to kind of realise I can't change her, I can't make her different. In fact, I think it probably took him time to realise that I was actually unwell. And that this wasn't just a bit of a phase, and when we get a little bit more sleep and when we get used to it, it'll all settle down. Once we got the diagnosis, I think that was really helpful for him, because again, he could put a label to it.
Right.
He could say, yeah, she's ill. It isn't that she's being irrational and difficult, she's unwell. And then I noticed that he changed the way that he used to approach it. So if I was having a real panic attack about something, instead of trying to kind of just say, it'll be fine, he kind of entered into it a little bit more, kind of almost walking alongside me in it. So he, you know, an example would be if I was really worried that she'd gone to sleep, he would say, actually, but 3 days ago, this happened and she slept really well at night. So we know that if this happens again, it will be okay. So he kind of approached my fears. So rather than dealing sort of, I guess, kind of getting cross with me about the actual issue, instead he went to what my fear was. My fear was always that I would ruin my child's sleeping patterns for the rest of their life, and that they would become educationally and socially sort of problematic because of that. And it kind of almost sounds so silly reflecting back, but I was very, very anxious about that. I think he found it really hard. I think he said to me about some members in our church who did come around, and sort of we did talk with them, but we were trying to work out when they came. And I think initially we didn't really tell many people that I was so poorly. I think we couldn't really talk about it. It was quite hard to talk about it. So I think he was probably quite lonely in that.
During your illness, where did God fit into, I suppose, that whole journey of yours?
Initially, when I was really poorly, I couldn't even pray. I don't think I would have been able to structure a sentence that made sense if it didn't revolve around sleep or feeding or my anxieties. So I don't think, I definitely wasn't sitting there and reading my Bible and every day and praying. I wasn't doing any of that. I was just in a world of my own. But I think there were times when I was just praying really simply, I need help. And that was all I could do. I don't think I could do anything deeper than that. After a while, I was able to kind of rationalise it a little bit and kind of look at myself and go, okay, I need to pray this through, because God is there. He's still the same God. He hasn't suddenly changed because I'm poorly. And I think a lot of what I've done post that with anxiety at times as well is to kind of go, okay, there's still the same God that I came to trust in, the same God of the Bible. He is never changing. He's always the same. He can be there yesterday, today, forever. He doesn't move. And so my emotions are all like this and all at sea, but he is steadfast. So I can come to him, and even though I don't understand why, and actually, you know, in the grand scheme of things, there are people who have had far more suffering and will have far more suffering, but in every bit of suffering, and I view this illness as suffering in that sense, in every bit of illness or suffering that we have, God doesn't always let us know why, but I just know that he doesn't change. He's the same, and I can trust that he's got this, even if I can't work out why or what the future holds. And for a while, I wasn't sure how quickly I was going to get better. And I could never have envisioned managing to go back to work, for example, or things like that. And that did happen. But I suppose you need to get to a point of going, actually, even if that doesn't happen, even if life looks a little bit different for me because of this, he still is not changing. He's still the same God, and his truths still remain.
If anybody listening is going through something similar, or they know somebody who's struggling in the same kind of way, what advice would you give them, having been through it, and I suppose also as a GP as well?
I think I'd say acknowledge it to be true. It's okay. So first of all, it's okay. It's true. If they're suffering, then they're suffering. So don't try and belittle it. Don't try and make it smaller than it is. I always wonder, if I didn't go and see that particular GP, if I'd have seen what might have been perhaps a more normal GP for me to have gone to see, perhaps a female GP who also had children, I may have got a different response. Not in a bad way. They may have said, oh, it's fine, this is normal. It's normal to feel so low after you've had a baby. It's just the baby blues, it'll get better. And actually that would have been the really wrong response for me because I was so poorly. So actually say that it is poorly, you know, they are poorly, that they are unwell, and acknowledge it, that they're not mad. I think if it's you yourself, I think again just going, you're not crazy, it's fine, you're unwell, and it can get better. And I think walking alongside them and not arguing with them is probably really, really important, because when somebody's incredibly anxious, they can't actually reason it through in the same way that you can when you're not incredibly anxious. And that goes for anxiety in general. I think really you can't reason. It takes for you to come out of yourself a little bit and looking back to be able to go, oh, this is what I could have done. At the moment you can't. So I think walk alongside them, pray for them if you pray, and just let them know that it's okay. And also there's light at the end of the tunnel. There really is in general. For most people, it gets better.
Thank you ever so much, Grace. It's been really helpful to hear your story and to hear how you've come through it as well. So thank you for sharing today.
No, it's a pleasure.